Okay, so before we get into this, we got to think, why are we doing this? Why are we putting Showa suspension on the Kove 450 Rally? And the long and short of it is that the bike that I got, it was time to do the suspension on it. It needed to be redone. It needed a whole new retrofit of shock and fork on it. So bike was worn out. It was used as a test bike. The suspension had been swapped out between bikes, things like that. So it was worn. It needed to be done. So I figured, well, I was going to spend the money on the Showa anyway. And after talking to Mason Klein, he voted that I talk to the guys over at AHM and we get this thing dialed in. So we did that. And basically, it is really awesome to see the knowledge that Brandon and the team over at AHM has when it comes to it. Like, they know exactly what they need to do to get the bike set up. Spring rates are very interesting. You got to remember something very interesting about these bikes is that they hold 8 gallons of gas. So that is a lot of weight on these bikes. And most companies are not used to springing a bike at that weight, how that bike is going to work. You got to remember 8 gallons of gas does weigh a lot, roughly about 7 pounds per gallon. So you fill that thing all the way to the top, that thing's going to have a lot of weight, not only on the front side, also on the back side. But not only that, but you're also going to have the weight down lower because of the design of the tank. So it's very, very important that you work on the suspension and you kind of understand the dynamics of the chassis and not just throw some forks at it, or just throw a shock at it. So very important to know that. It's good to go with somebody that knew. In this case, Mason and Brandon over at AHM worked together a lot on developing the bike setup for the Dakar. He spent a lot of time testing, a lot of time doing stuff on it and getting the thing ready to go. So I'm happy. I'm anxious to get the thing going, but you got to know a few things before you get into it. So in this particular case, I went and looked for some secondhand CRF suspension. So one of the key components is that the front forks are 49 millimeters. Now, when you're going to pick this stuff, you have to know, and you got to kind of stick with a particular year, a particular model, so it makes it easy when you go shopping for things. So, and I'll get into that, is not only is it the front forks, but it's also the front brake setup that you have to know. It's also the rear shock setup that you have to know. You got to make sure you get the one with the right reservoir. So we're going to start it off and just talk about the years. So I'm using the 2017 CRF 450R suspension, front and rear on the bike. So that's what I was able to find. That is what's working on it. The front forks, 49 millimeter. Now, something you have to watch out for is that on those 17 and newers, they are putting certain setup on those bikes. They're actually running a larger front disc. They're not running a 240 or a 250. They're up to that 260 range. And when you do that, you have to use a bracket if you want to use the stock rotor. If you want to use the standard setup, then you can get those same forks and you can get the same setup. You just have to know that you have those forks. You have to know what year you're running, because otherwise the spacing is going to be different. So we'll jump into the garage here in a minute and I'll show you guys some of the stuff what to look out for and what I'm talking about. But you have to know what year. So pick a year, go with that year. Pick that model and go with that model, because there are slight variations. In certain years, they did certain things, and in certain years, they did other things. And so you have to know what you're working with. And that's very important when you're doing a retrofit like this, when it's from another manufacturer. Even though it's Showa, and Showa makes suspension for a lot of different companies, you have to know when you pick that stuff. So moving forward, front forks, all set. Then you got to do the rear shock. Rear shock went with the same thing, went with the 2017 CRF 450R. And on that one, it's not as critical as the front forks. It didn't really change a whole lot of it other than springs and internals. But the main thing on that one is that the rear shock has to be the one that has the horizontal reservoir, not the one with the vertical reservoir. So you got to have a horizontal reservoir. When you're looking at the shock, you'll see the reservoirs on the horizontal. It runs left to right, and you're going to have the nitrogen fill. You're going to have that on one side, not from the bottom. So it's very, very important, because the one from the bottom will not fit the bike. You have to use the one that runs across the top. So again, we'll head over to the garage. I'll show you guys what I'm talking about, what we're doing. You may have seen one of the videos already, but we'll talk a little bit more in depth about it. But those are the things you got to watch out for. So remember, pick a year, pick a bike, and then stick with that, because you're going to need more than just the forks and more than just the shock. You want to make sure you're getting all the right stuff. So with that being said, let's jump over to the garage and let's talk a little bit more about what we need to know, and so you guys can get this done on your bike. Okay, so in the garage, we've got our pointer. Now let's talk about the Showa Retrofit on the Kove 450 Rally. So we'll start from the front and then we'll work our way to the back. So very first thing is CRF 450R 2017 was the model that I went with on this. So everything is pretty standard, running the standard axle spacers from Kove with their axle. It does fit the Honda fork lugs. The spacing puts it correct right in the middle there. So the only thing you're going to notice is that there is a little bit of a gap right here, but it's not that critical. It's not that far in. So it works out. All the standard torque specs, pinch bolts stay the same. I have the 450 Rally Pro, and so that does not have the speedometer setup that the other bikes do, I believe. There is a ring that goes here typically for the speedo sensor. Not running that. I'm going to be running a rally comp, so not necessarily set up for that. However, you could use either the standard pickup by adapting it into there. I might make an adapter to get that. So if you guys decided to do this, you could just screw in the normal adapter using the ring that's already there. But in this particular case, I'm just going to be using a GPS speedometer. So GPS based, I don't need to have that. So we'll move on to the next bit, which is going to be the brakes. Okay, so on the brakes, this was one of the things that kind of threw me for a little bit of a loop. Honda on the CRF 450 back in around 2015-16, they changed to a 260 millimeter front rotor. So the fork lugs, I had purchased a 270 millimeter brake kit for the bike, thinking that it was still running a standard 250 type setup. Anyway, long story short, 2017 CRF 450R, that fork lug, that fork setup was with a 260 millimeter brake rotor initially. I added the 270 millimeter brake kit, and the spacing actually worked out so that I could keep and retain the actual stock front brake rotor. Perfect alignment on that. The only thing you have to watch out when doing this is there is a little bit of spacing, as you can see in the between the bracket and the caliper bracket and the fork lug. There's 3 mil. You need to add 3 mils over. That's what I had to do on mine. It took me a little bit to do it, but it's pretty simple. Sheet of paper between the brake pads, clamp the brake lever. That'll center the rotor over, or it'll center the caliper over, and then you can just get an idea of what spacers that you need to put in there. For my particular case, for this, it was 3 millimeters to get that over to that side. So not very, very complicated, but other than that, standard torque specs, everything bolts right up. So that is on the front fork setup. Added the SKF wipers there. And other than that, it is straight up Showa setup, all lined up by the guys over at AHM. So that's what the front end is. Again, stock axles, stock spacers from the Kove, running a 2017 fork lug that was designed for the 260 millimeter front brake disc, and then added a 270 millimeter adapter for that same year CRF 450R, and I'm able to retain the stock brake disc there. So nothing much to do there. Let's jump to the back. All right, so this one's going to be a little harder to see, but this is the 2017 CRF 450R rear shock installed on the Kove. Again, that is a Showa rear shock. Have the adjusters over on the left-hand side of the bike, Inside, you can see way back in there is the reservoir. As mentioned, it is a horizontal style reservoir, not the vertical style. So that's a quick indicator of which shock you're running. And again, spring rates and things like that can vary. So don't worry about it. I mean, that's one of those things you're going to have the shocks gone through anyway. Sprung for your weight, revalved for your riding style, but bolts right in. The only thing to watch out for is when you go to install the top of the shock. I had a video earlier on this. There is a frame spacer that needs to be in there between the shock, because the eyelet on top is thinner than what the frame is set up for. So you need some washers and shims up on that eyelet that's actually behind the gas tank. Back in there, you'll see it when you're taking them apart and putting them in. So again, there's another video that I did on this explaining about that shim. I'll attach it to this here in just a second so you guys can watch that. But pretty basic stuff. This thing is straightforward. I mean, literally like plug and play. Again, Brandon and the team over at AHM getting this thing all set up for me and good to go. Okay, so got the Showa shock from the CRF installed on the 450 Kove. And one of the things you need to know when doing this, and actually Brandon at AHM told me about it, is right in there is kind of hard to see, but there are some shims that need to go between the frame and the shock bushing, shock bearing there. So have to watch out for that. They are a little bit, let's see if we could get it to focus a little better here. Right in there. So you can barely see them. It's on both sides. It is mirrored, a little more difficult to see on this side. But that basically keeps the slop on the shock from going side to side and gets it a little bit centered, a little better and in properly. So a little bit of a rite of passage if you're doing the Showa retrofit on the Kove 450 Rally. Okay, so back in the studio. All right, that is the 450 Rally factory retrofit with the Showa 450R suspension on it. So pretty straightforward. I mean, it just took a lot of experimenting and getting things right, and getting the spacing just right on that front brake caliper. But it's a pretty easy setup. Again, I think the biggest thing that I learned on this is that there were slight changes that aren't necessarily out there, particularly on the front caliper. The pin lengths or the dimensions on the floating pins changes a little bit. So there's just some things to watch out for. That's why I say it's very, very important that you are clear about what year you're shopping for and what year you're retrofitting onto the bike. But I'm absolutely looking forward to it. I mean, it's the suspension. Obviously, AHM has been doing a heck of a job with a lot of the bikes down in Baja, Colton Udall, and a lot of riders, including Mason Klein, on their suspension, and have nothing but good things to say about it. So I'm excited to ride this bike and see what it is like. It's getting even closer. I'm literally waiting for the last parts to land today so that I could get that bike fired off and maybe take a lap around the block. So excited to see. What did you guys think? I don't know. What do you think? I mean, is this what you would do if it was time to do the suspension on your bike? Go full retrofit, rebuild the stock stuff. What has been your experiences? We've got a lot of Koves out in the world now, out in the wild, logging miles and miles and miles. What have you guys done to the suspension? So I'm curious to read your comments below. If you haven't already, don't forget, like, share, subscribe, do all of that fun stuff, help the channel grow. And if you guys got ideas and things you want to see about, particularly about the Kove, some of the stuff that I've ran across, you're definitely going to want to follow along. Let me know, send me questions. Up next, and I'm working on this video a little bit later today, I'm actually working on the gearing on the bike. So I changed the sprockets around. I got some part numbers. I got some stuff for you to know. You're definitely going to want to stick around for that. So again, don't forget, like, share, subscribe, all of that fun stuff so you don't miss a video. We'll see you soon.